June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m., Easy Red Sector, Omaha Beach. The steel ramp of the LCVP groaned, a heavy mechanical sound that was immediately drowned out by the rhythmic, terrifying clatter, clatter, clatter of lead meeting metal. It sounded like 1,000 hammers striking a tin roof at once. That was the MG-42, Hitler's Buzzsaw, and it was already zeroed in on our position. We hadn't even seen the sand yet, but the German gunners in the pillboxes atop the bluffs were already painting our hull with lead. The air inside the boat was thick with the smell of salt, grease, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. But there was no time to breathe it in. The coxswain yelled something, a command lost in the roar of the surf and the thundering 88mm shells screaming overhead. Then the ramp dropped. It didn't just open, it collapsed into the surf, and the world turned into a meat grinder. The first 4 men in line, guys I had eaten breakfast with just hours ago, didn't even take a step. They were erased. A concentrated stream of tracers tore through the opening, stitching a line of fire across their chests. They slumped forward into the rising tide, their blood swirling into the white foam of the English Channel before their boots even touched the ground. There was no go, go, go. There was only the sudden, violent vacuum of life. I rolled over the side of the boat, hitting the water like a stone. The weight was staggering. 70 pounds of gear, a saturated M1 Garand, ammunition belts, and a gas mask that felt like an anchor. The water was deeper than they told us. It wasn't knee-deep. It was up to my chest, pulling at me, trying to drag me under. Every time I tried to lunge forward, the tide pushed back. Around me, the water was erupting. It wasn't just splashing, it was boiling. Thousands of machine gun rounds were caving into the surface, creating tiny, deadly geysers of white spray. If you stood up, you were a target. If you stayed down, you drowned. A massive thud shook the very seabed beneath my boots. An 88mm shell landed 10 yards to my left. The geyser it sent up wasn't water. It was a pillar of black mud, jagged shrapnel, and pieces of an LCVP that had been blown clean out of the water. The shockwave felt like a physical punch to my lungs. I saw a man from another squad get tossed into the air like a rag doll, his limbs flailing against a sky gray with cordite and smoke. He hit the water and never resurfaced. There was no squad anymore. There was no chain of command. The noise was so absolute, so deafening, that it stripped away every sense except the primal urge to move. I scrambled toward a row of Czech hedgehogs, those twisted steel beams the Germans had planted to stop our tanks. They were the only things offering even a sliver of protection. I crawled over the slick, wet sand, my fingers digging into the grit, while the MG-42s from the WN-62 strongpoint continued their relentless mechanical reaping. Zip, zip, zip. The bullets hissed past my ears, so close I could feel the heat of them. They were striking the steel hedgehog I was huddled behind, the ping of the impacts vibrating through the metal and into my skull. To my right, a medic was trying to reach a man screaming in the surf, but a sniper from the heights put a round through the medic's helmet before he could even open his kit. The medic went down hard, his body rolling with the waves, his red cross marking disappearing under the red-stained water. The beach was a graveyard of machinery and men. To the left, a DD tank was burning. sending oily black smoke billowing into the air, providing the only meager concealment we had. I looked back, trying to find a familiar face, a shoulder to lean on, but there was nothing but chaos. The men who had survived the initial landing were scattered, pinned down behind obstacles, or paralyzed by the sheer volume of fire. Every time someone tried to make a break for the shingle, a fresh volley of mortar fire would bracket the area, sending plumes of sand and human debris into the air. The crossfire was perfect. It was a kill zone designed with German precision. From the heights of Point du Hoc down to the draws, every inch of Omaha was covered. There was no front line. The front line was wherever you were currently bleeding. I watched a sergeant try to rally a group of men behind a cluster of rocks. He didn't even get a word out before a mortar round landed directly in their midst. In a flash of orange and a roar of thunder, the entire group was gone. Just a crater where men had been standing a second before. I gripped my rifle, the wood slick with sea salt and oil, and pressed my face into the cold, wet sand. 10 minutes. It had only been 10 minutes since the ramp dropped, and the platoon was a memory. The only sound louder than the artillery was the relentless, rhythmic brrrp of the German guns. Never overheating, never stopping, just feeding on the tide of men being pushed onto the shore. 600 seconds. That's all it took. You don't think about time in minutes when you're pinned down on that sand. You think about it in heartbeats, and every single one feels like it's going to be your last. The beach wasn't just a stretch of land. It was a calibrated killing floor, a geometric masterpiece of slaughter. The Germans in those concrete nests, WN-62, WN-65, they didn't just fire at us. They wove a carpet of lead. They had practiced this. They had overlapping sectors of fire, interlocking fields that meant if the gunner on the left missed you, the one on the right didn't. They formed a V of fire, a crossfire so tight and so precise that the air itself seemed to be made of flying metal. I watched the sand. It was alive, not from the wind, but from the thousands of rounds stitching jagged lines into the shore. Every time a burst hit, the sand would erupt in tiny, violent fountains, snapping against my goggles, filling my mouth with the grit of pulverized stone and salt. Miller was the first to go in that 10-minute stretch. He was our RTO, the radio guy. He was carrying 60 pounds of electronics on his back that might as well have been a bullseye. He was trying to keep that heavy SCR 300 dry, hunched over like he was protecting a child in the surf. But that antenna was a lightning rod for every sniper and MG-42 gunner on the ridge. I heard the crack first, the sharp, whip-like sound of a high-velocity round breaking the sound barrier right next to my ear. Then, an explosion. Not a grenade, but the radio itself. A 20mm cannon shell from a flak gun on the heights caught the battery pack. 1 second Miller was there, his face tight with focus, trying to call for naval support. And the next, he was just a cloud of gray smoke and jagged plastic. He didn't even scream. He was just deleted. The radio parts rained down around us like hail, and Miller's body was thrown forward into the rising tide, his mission over before he could transmit a single word. Then there was Jackson. He was our BAR man, the heavy hitter of the squad. He was big, strong, the kind of guy who looked like he could carry the whole war on his shoulders without breaking a sweat. He finally found a patch of sand that didn't seem to be exploding, and dropped his bipod to give us some cover fire. He was down for maybe 3 seconds, just enough time to rack the bolt and settle his cheek against the stock. He never pulled the trigger. A burst of MG-42 fire caught him mid-breath. It didn't just hit him, it dismantled him. The rounds punched through his shoulder and chest with such mechanical force that his body was jolted backward, his boots kicking up a spray of wet sand before he went completely still. The bar, the gun we all counted on to save us, was half buried in the muck, silent and useless. The ground was shaking. It wasn't a vibration. It was a constant, rhythmic pounding that rattled your teeth in their sockets and made your vision blur. The 88mm guns were raining down from the bluffs, and the mortars were bracketing the seawall with terrifying accuracy. Every time a shell landed, the shockwave would lift you off the ground, just for a fraction of a second, before slamming you back down into the wet, blood-soaked sand. There was no cover. You think of a beach as wide and open, but here it was a trap. The only things to hide behind were the burning hulks of the DD tanks that never made it, or the bodies of the guys who had landed 5 minutes before us. I found myself crawling behind a pile of discarded gear and a waterlogged crate of ammunition that didn't belong to anyone anymore. The sound. God, the sound. It was a physical weight pressing down on your skull. It was the high-pitched screaming of the shells, the zipping of the rounds passing inches from your neck, and that terrifying, unending ripsaw noise of the German machine guns. They didn't fire in rhythmic bursts like our Brownings. They fired so fast, 1,200 rounds a minute, that the individual shots blurred into a single terrifying shriek. Brrrrt, like someone was tearing a giant sheet of heavy canvas right over your head. It never stopped. They didn't even have to aim. They just swept the line back and forth, like they were harvesting wheat. I looked to my left. Corporal Henderson was gone. I didn't even see it happen. No sound, no flash, just an empty space where he'd been crawling. To my right, our squad leader, Sergeant Mike, was pinned down behind a steel hedgehog. He was screaming something, his mouth moving wide, his face flushed red with the effort of trying to be heard over the apocalypse, but the noise swallowed his voice whole. He tried to signal for a medic, raising his hand just an inch too high. As soon as his fingers cleared the steel beam, a line of tracers stitched across the metal, throwing a shower of white-hot sparks into his face. He flinched back, and in that moment, a mortar round landed directly on the other side of that beam. The flash blinded me, a searing, white-hot light that burned the image of the beach into my retinas. When the smoke cleared, the steel hedgehog was twisted like a pretzel, and the sergeant was just gone. No body, no gear, just a blackened patch of sand and a dented helmet rolling slowly in the surf. It kept happening, mechanically, systematically. It wasn't a fight, it was a mass production of death. Every man who tried to rise was cut down instantly. Every man who stayed still was zeroed in by the mortars. I saw the flamethrower guy, Scotty. He was struggling with the massive tanks on his back, trying to reach a crevice in the rocks. A single tracer, one glowing red dot in a sea of lead, hit the pressurized tank. The explosion was a roar of orange fire that defied the gray, miserable morning. For a heartbeat, the beach was lit up as bright as noon, and then there was only the suffocating smell of burnt hair and gasoline. I checked my watch. The glass was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks across the face, but the hands were still moving. 10 minutes. Only 10 minutes had passed since the ramp dropped. I looked around, my eyes stinging from the cordite, the sulfur, and the thick, black smoke of burning oil. I looked for the squad. I looked for the guys I'd trained with in the mud of Georgia, the guys I'd played cards with on the transport ship, the guys who knew the names of my parents. Nothing. There was no one left moving in my sector. No one shouting. No one firing back. Just the tide coming in, cold and indifferent, washing over the boots of men who would never walk again. The only thing left alive was the Hitler's saw up on the cliff, still screaming, still searching for anything that breathed. My squad, 12 men, 12 lives, had been erased from the map in 600 seconds. I was alone on a mile of sand that wanted me dead, and the only sound left was the mechanical, indifferent rhythm of the German guns cutting through the air where my friends used to be. The pebbles under my boots weren't just stones. They were slick with sea salt and the oil leaking from a dozen wrecked landing craft. This was the shingle, the last barrier of the dead zone. We were hunched so low our chins were scraping the rocks, while the air above us was a solid ceiling of flying lead. "Bangalores! Get the Bangalores up here!" The shout was barely a whisper against the thunder of the 88s. I saw 2 men from the 2nd Rangers dragging the long steel tubes, the Bangalore torpedoes, sliding them through the muck toward the concertina wire. They moved like ghosts in the smoke. One man took a round to the neck, his blood spraying the gray stones, but he didn't stop until that tube was shoved deep under the rusted coils of the German wire. Then came the blast. It wasn't a clean sound. It was a jagged, earth-shaking crack that sent a wall of dirt, wire, and white-hot shrapnel into the sky. The wire didn't just break. It evaporated. "Go! Now! Move or die!" We surged through the gap, boots sliding on the wet clay of the bluffs. My lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. Every breath was a mix of sulfur, ozone, and the metallic tang of the spray. We weren't a squad anymore. We were a pack of animals clawing our way out of a pit. The MG-42s were still screaming, but we were finally under their traverse. They couldn't tilt the barrels low enough to hit us anymore. We were in the dead space at the foot of the concrete, but the Germans started dropping stick grenades over the ledge. Thud, thud, thud. They looked like potato mashers falling from the sky. One landed 3 feet away, and I threw myself into the mud, the explosion lifting me up and slamming me back down, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. We reached the first bunker, a massive gray slab of reinforced concrete that looked like a prehistoric monster. You could hear the mechanical clatter, clatter, clatter of the gun inside, the vibrations humming through the very ground we were kneeling on. The embrasure, the narrow horizontal slit where the gun poked out, was spitting a 3-foot tongue of orange flame. Covering fire! I emptied my M1 Garand into the slot, the ping of the empty clip being ejected lost in the roar. Beside me, a kid whose name I never knew pulled the pin on a Mark II fragmentation grenade. He didn't toss it. He pitched it like a baseball, right into the dark mouth of the bunker. A muffled thump followed. Then a plume of thick, oily black smoke coughed out of the slit. The machine gun inside stopped. For the first time in an hour, there was a hole in the noise. But the trenches were still alive. We rolled over the top of the parapet and into the German lines. This wasn't the war they showed in the training films. It was narrow, cramped, and smelled of stale cabbage, sweat, and cordite. It was a war of inches. I turned a corner and ran headlong into a German gunner. He didn't have time to raise his Mauser, and I didn't have time to aim. I lunged, the heavy walnut stock of my Garand connecting with his jaw in a sickening crunch of bone and teeth. We went down into the mud, a frantic, desperate scramble of limbs. My fingers clawed for a trench knife, but I found a discarded entrenching tool instead. I swung it with everything I had left, the steel blade biting into the side of his neck. He slumped, the life going out of his eyes, his blood hot and sticky against my sleeves. "Flamethrower! Front!" The roar of the M22 flamethrower was like the sound of 1,000 blowtorches ignited at once. A massive jet of thickened gasoline surged past me, arching into the doorway of the secondary command bunker. The heat was instantaneous and absolute. It scorched the hair off my arms and blistered the paint on my helmet. Inside, the screaming started. It was a high, inhuman wail that cut through the thunder of the artillery. Figures emerged from the bunker, not as soldiers, but as living torches, their uniforms melted to their skin. They didn't fire back. They just collapsed into the dirt, the fire continuing to hiss and roar as it consumed the oxygen in the trench. We kept moving, room to room, trench to trench. It was a mechanical cycle. Grenade, spray the room with Thompson fire, clear the corners, move. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely reload, the brass casings falling into the mud with a soft clink. We found a communication post. The radio equipment was sparking. The German operators slumped over their desks. One was still alive, reaching for a Luger on the floor. A single round from a .45 1911 ended that. The room went silent. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the German mortars on the ridge finally stopped as the crews were overrun by the guys from the 29th. I leaned against the cold concrete wall of the pillbox, my chest heaving, my vision blurred by the sweat and salt stinging my eyes. The Hitler saw had finally gone quiet. No more zip, zip, zip through the air. No more fountains of sand. I walked back to the edge of the bluff, my boots heavy with the weight of the clay. And I looked down at what we had left behind. The beach was gone. It wasn't Omaha anymore. It was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered wood. From this height, the LCVP boats looked like broken toys scattered by a giant. The water wasn't blue, and it wasn't gray. It was a deep, nauseating crimson for 50 yards out into the surf. I could see the hedgehogs we had hidden behind, the burning tanks still sending columns of black smoke into the overcast sky, and the shapes, thousands of shapes. They lay in rows, they lay in clusters, they lay where the tide was slowly beginning to pull them back into the sea. 10 minutes, that's what it took to lose the squad. 2 hours to take the hill. I looked at the 3 other guys standing near me. We didn't look like victors. Our uniforms were shredded. Our faces were blackened by soot and blood, and our eyes were wide and empty. The 1,000-yard stare. We had broken through the wall. We had silenced the guns. But as I looked back at that blood-soaked sand, I realized the beach had taken everything we were. The Lo Satsing, the slaughterhouse, was quiet now. But but the silence was heavier than the noise had ever been. The guns were dead, and so was everyone I had started the morning with.